morning, good evening, good night, wherever you may be in the world. Hope you're all having a good day or about to have a good day, depending where you are. We're dialing in from the UK in London, and where we're just about to get started. So give us a few minutes. I'm just going to get warmed up and we'll kick off with this morning's webinar on branding products and services. Mark, how are you doing this morning?
All right, Richie. Well, we've just done our own little weekly podcast thing, which is always a nice pick-me-up. Had a great guest on there, didn't we? But we were just talking about your heading back to India, which is exciting, and we're getting to the end of 2021. I think it's a year which was a lot about coping, and hopefully 2022 is a year more about new possibilities again.
I love that. It's a really nice refresh and reframe, Mark.
Yeah, it's when you sort of rearview mirror, you get a bit more reductive on things, but the 2020 was actually sort of quite high octane, adrenaline, exciting, challenging, but fresh and evocative. But 2020 was a bit of a grind. I mean, we came back in January and it was all going to be fine, and then it wasn't. Might be the same in 2022, who knows? But no, my sense is that there's sort of new possibilities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And regardless of the macro environment, we all need to find our way and find our sense of what those new possibilities are in a new ever-changing world, I guess. Yeah. I was watching a news channel this morning that talked about the role of freedom and the fact that actually all of us now are living out literally day to day because we just don't know what restrictions are going to be placed on us from one day to the next. And that very unnerving, I guess, in many ways. But also has many different implications for the business environment as well, based on marketing being consumer-centric.
Yeah. In this very moment, it feels like the curtain's coming down for the Christmas period itself, in a similar way to 12 months ago, actually. Because you remember all the tiers kicked up on, I think it was the 23rd of December. It's different this year, obviously, because there's a lot more known, there's a lot more immunity and vaccinations. But at this specific moment, it does feel a little bit like that curtain's coming down.
Yeah, for sure. Well, look, depending on where you are in the world, I suspect we're all the different phases and stages of this cycle that we're all going through. But let's hope that this session can be a little bit more of a pick-me-up and a more positive note around what we can do about the issues, particularly from a marketing perspective. So why don't we kick off for this session this morning or afternoon or night, wherever you may be. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to the In Conversation With series in partnership with Pearson, BTEC, and the School of Marketing. My name is Richie Mehta. I'm the CEO and founder of the School of Marketing, where we are a cutting-edge disruptive marketing training organization that has really partnered with a similarly energetic and innovative organization in Pearson, trying to really look at the way that we deliver BTEC qualifications, particularly in the marketing and business arena. And as part of this webcast series, we've been interviewing some of the biggest thought leaders across the marketing industry, starting out with Claire Riddle from Pearson, moving into Lex, the CMO of L'Oreal. And today we have another stellar, outstanding guest for us to pick his brains, as it were, around the cutting edge leading techniques that are happening right now in this space. So I'd love to introduce to you none other than Mark Evans. So Mark Evans is currently the Managing Director of Marketing and Digital at the Direct Line Group, which is the UK's largest general insurer. Prior to that, Mark has had an illustrious career, having worked in a variety of multinationals such as HSBC, and even starting out his career in the FMCG world at Mars. So he brings a great perspective, and probably no better man to talk about the role of branding products and services than Mark. So Mark, welcome to this episode today, and love to get started.
Yeah, thank you, Richie. Privileged to be here as ever, and hopefully I can pass on some of the wisdom that I've been gifted from others.
Well, hey, absolutely. Well, look, for all of you who don't know, Direct Line today sits as probably one of the most iconic brands in the UK. And it probably started a few decades ago and shot up to success and fame during the course of that time in the insurance space. But it really did lose a little bit of its shine coming in perhaps perhaps in the previous 5 to 10 years, and Mark has done a stellar job in being able to revitalize it. So I'd love to perhaps just kick off a little bit with understanding what the Derelict Story was all about.
Yeah, well, no, it's a great place to start. It's a story that has several chapters, like all good books, including your own, Richie. It was the original disruptor of insurance a long, long time ago in the 1980s. It disintermediated the broker model, which now you think that's quite a marginal thing. Well, that was the market in 1985. So it was a very explicit cut out the middleman and be the enterprise, be the ecosystem, be the platform, all the things that many brands have tried to do in the last 5 or 10 years. It did that back in the day and had many successful years, but it was so successful that many people copied the model. That gave rise to the advent of price comparison websites, which then turned the tide and actually started to disintermediate direct brands. So there's a big pendulum swing. And so the most recent couple of chapters run a bit like this. By 2014, the brand was in freefall, which was a problem because it was really the profit engine for the Direct Line group. Amongst a stable of brands, it was the biggest and most profitable. It was the name above the door. It was the spiritual heartland and DNA of the company. And yet it was definitely in freefall. It lost its place, lost its way, lost its mojo. And so we set out to disrupt again and had a lot of success. But what's really interesting about that was it was very much a back to basics marketing repositioning. No silver bullets, no secret sauce, just what is missing in the world? What does this brand need to stand for? How do we deliver on that promise? How do we make it big and epic along the way? And what's perhaps interesting is that we went all the way back to the fundamentals of the category, which was that nobody was talking about what insurance actually does. Everybody was so fixated on price that the consumer, the providers, the brands had just lost sight of what was actually the raison d'etre of the sector. That was the insight hiding in plain sight. And so we did a huge rebrand repositioning internally and externally through all comms. The campaign with Harvey Keitel, the Fixer campaign, really turned the business and the brand around, won lots of awards, won 3 IPA Gold Effectiveness Awards in 2016 and 18. And it was a great transformation. And then the most recent chapter is an extension on that, which was that campaign was working really well, but there was something in the construct which wasn't quite right, which was that we were saying we were great, or Harvey Keitel was saying that we were great, but we didn't have a comparator. You know, what are we better than? Are we the best? And so you hopefully will have noticed, because we spent quite a lot of money on it in the last 2 years, that we've moved to the Superheroes campaign, where we're beating Bumblebee and RoboCop and Donatello to the chase to help customers with their insurance problems. And so that's added another layer of epicness, if that's a word, and drama, but continuing that journey to lead and disrupt the market. So I think these sort of chapters have punctuated a story of always wanting to be a challenger in a market which is relatively low interest, relatively low trust, relatively low frequency. And so I always say, you know, it's not compulsory to be a masochist, but it helps because it's been really, really challenging, but so rewarding for it. But through it all, there's no secret sauce. It's just kind of the marketing basics of branding.
Well, yeah, Mark, what an amazing story, really, in terms of being able to kind of revitalize something. And I know a lot of people on this program will be thinking or be coming at it from an education perspective and maybe leading education brands, which in many respects you can have the same claim as insurance, right? Undifferentiated, need for constant revitalization of their brands, earning trust, credibility, particularly when it comes to qualifications. And so I wonder if there's any translatable learnings that we can take from branding in the insurance category and what you did with Direct Line, and maybe make it meaningful into what maybe educators need to be thinking about in this space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there's definitely metaphors. If we maybe just what's most valuable is to focus in on trust, actually, as a point. When you're going to make an episodic commitment to something which has a high cost and there's potentially a lot riding on it, I think you're into that trust space. So I've not thought of it before until you mentioned it, but I think that's something that links the two. Now, you and I have both met Rachel Botsman, and she talks trust being a confident relationship with the unknown. And I think it's a great definition. it's not transparency and knowing everything that everybody's doing all the time. It's actually sort of imagining how they will be when you don't have sight. Confident relationship with the unknown. I mean, let's take insurance. You don't really want to think about it. You certainly don't want to have to use it, and not very often, if at all. And therefore, you don't really know how they're going to show up when you actually need them. I think education is also sort of that sort of flight into the unknown. How will it actually be through the course? How will it be valued on the other side? What will I genuinely learn? Will it really resonate? You're going into something for a fixed period of time that's not short, and then there's lots of unknowns. And so the thread for me, how do you create confidence, a confident relationship with the unknown? I mean, it's just clarity of what it is that you stand for, what differentiates you, and evidence points. Back to what's the propositions that act as reasons to believe. Classical marketing stuff. So in the case of Direct Line, we said we're the fixers. So what? So we put out market leading propositions and really communicated the hell out of them. So whereas you might take you 2 weeks to get your car back when it's been damaged in an accident through other insurers, for us, we'll get it back to you within 7 days. Every day we're late, we'll give you £10. So properly putting our money where our mouth is. Your mobile phone is stolen. Okay, so people are on their phones 400 times a day or whatever it is. Saying we'll get it to you in 3 days, not good enough. So we'll get it to you that day. And so it's the service delivery points which act as proof that people can make an assessment that it will hold true. The promise will be true. I can be confident with that unknown. And I think that's probably true of education as well. What are the proof points that make it believable?
I do love that notion, and particularly that's why perhaps there's been an obsession with things like league tables in the education space. But also the linkage between brand and service is probably no more relevant in education than in other industries. So I think that's a lovely point there. However, I would take up challenge in a gauntlet in some respects, because I think when it comes to branding, emotion trumps rational thinking when it comes to mental availability and actually getting into the memory structures of people's minds. So what's the balance, therefore? And what I mean by that, guys, is the thought that you need to kind of create the emotional connection between yourself and your students, or in the case of insurance customers. And you do that through the power of storytelling, or you do that through the power of bringing a characterization to life as opposed to focusing on the rational. I'd love just to maybe get your take on that, and then how, I guess, proof points then play in the mix too.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an and, not an or. It's the obvious answer, but it's true. So you're right. I get my car back in 7 days. It's like, oh, okay. That doesn't sort of make me sing, make my heart leap. But that's the role of creativity.
Yep.
To create the connection. And the very best proof points are not going to land if they're not landed in the right way that cuts through, because our brains have very natural filters, and we'll screen out what's not interesting or engaging. So I think it's both. And so the best form of creativity takes something of substance but adds a little sparkle of magic on top, and it kind of has to be both, because if it's just emotion without substance, at some point, particularly as people get through the funnel, it will start to fold. And I think the funnel is the sort of the most underused discipline in marketing. It's been around for decades, but it's not a very vivid conversation often. But there, you can see that it's essentially, it's probably emotion that gets people into the top of the funnel. Yeah. But it's rational things, purchase journeys and ease of transaction that gets people through the funnel to transact. So I think, as ever, it's not a slopey shoulder answer. I think it's true. It's both. It's an and.
No, I totally get that. When it comes to education in particular, I think a lot of people don't spend enough time getting that top of the funnel bit right, and therefore creating that emotional connect with the student at the outset of that journey. And I think that a lot more can be done. I think there's almost a skew towards the rational, given the academic sort of landscape that we operate in, and not enough on the creative lens. I mean, would you say that sort of is the case in your experience of our world? Perhaps I know, appreciating you're not living directly in it.
Yeah, I mean, the creativity and imagination is in, it's in quite short supply, isn't it? But it is what elevates things and makes them cut through. I wouldn't describe myself necessarily as a creative person, but I love the creative process and facilitating, enabling it. And sometimes it takes a slightly warped brain to make that leap, but those leaps can be gargantuan. So hence, it's a bit of an aside, but I think it's relevant. I'm an active campaigner for neurodiversity as a legitimate part of the D&I agenda. And if you're thinking about the crux of diversity, apart from social justice and fairness, is to drive better performance because of divergent thinking, then why wouldn't you go to those whose brains are wired differently from the outset, which is dyslexia, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, and so on and so forth. But I'll just tell a tiny little story that brings it to life, maybe, which is that we were noodling on what to do with Direct Line, and we went through a creative pitch process, and Saatchi's ultimately went on to win. And we had a really good conversation about what the role of insurance was in customers' lives. And it was in the lift that Paul Silburn, sadly now passed away, with the account guy, the planner, Richard Huntington. He said, I think I know what insurance is. It's like being an account director in an ad agency. You've just got to get stuff done, make it happen. It's a little bit like that Harvey Keitel character in Pulp Fiction. And Richard said to Paul, yeah, look, okay, let's not get carried away. That can come later. Let's just ground ourselves in the business problem. But lo and behold, that became the idea. And it was just a moment of madness / genius that transcended. And so I think we do, particularly as the world gets more digital and mechanistic, I think we lose sight of the role of pure creativity at our peril. Quite passionate about that point, which is why, you just need to make sure that, remind yourself that diversity of thought that drives performance is, is genuinely about appreciating different points of view.
Totally. Mark, I want to come and get your perspective on the role of established versus disruptive brands in today's context. And education is a classic, is a classic role for having the establishment reigning true. You only have to look at Oxbridge, Ivy Leagues, Red Brick, to see how long they've been around, and therefore, hence, sort of almost claiming a righteous place in a league table. Versus the more disruptive, new age, technologically driven brands coming through. And how would you say that a brand that is trying to be disruptive actually gains cut through versus the huge legacy and heritage of some of the more establishments?
Well, a couple of interesting thoughts, I think. One is education is now a globally competitive market. It used to be partitioned into geographical boundaries, not at all now. So the people who are applying for the Ivy League universities, I'm sure the mix has changed massively. Actually, I'm just reminded that one of the schools that I used to play rugby against back in the day when I was a lad, Clifton College in Bristol, now has 40% Chinese occupancy. So I think education has become a truly global market, and the people will flock towards what's seen as best. But on the point about challenger versus established, I read a lovely thing the other day, which was Jeff Bezos did a lecture to some, I think, MBA students way before Amazon had started. And they basically mocked him. Yeah. They all bet against him. And I think they sort of, bless type thing. Of course, none of them had the vision for what it would become. But he made a really interesting point, which was that, the adaptability is the key thing here. And now, of course, we see Amazon looking to go into bricks. And he made a really interesting point, which is that, as in bricks versus clicks, that you've got lots of retailers who've been in bricks who are trying to get into clicks. And Amazon is a clicks business that's trying to get into bricks. And he says, actually, I think they're equally tough. For Amazon to be a high street retailer, they're equally tough. But I think we'll be better just because we're not as encumbered by legacy thinking, legacy culture, legacy. And so the ultimate advantage of the disruptor is the ability to adapt and take on those, don't underestimate them, but take on those big challenges. And I think that pervades really, you are, as soon as you've got something to defend and protect, you're more conservative in the way you go about things, and also will tend to assume you're better than you are. So it means, of course, that everything is there to be disrupted. Will Google be as strong as they are in 10 years' time. Facebook peaked. They said the Roman Empire would never end, and of course it did. And they said that the US would be the dominant country forever, but China will overtake them. So I just think you have to be open-minded that nothing's forever.
Wow. And look, I love that story about Amazon. I read that article too, and it was fascinating to get that take from an influencer. Mark Ritson is in our industry is one of the kingpin thought leaders in this space. Mark, I want to move away from branding a little bit and actually talk about product proposition and product development. In our world, in the education space today, it feels like there are certain subject matter and courses that are more in vogue and more in demand. And actually formats constantly changing and disrupting as well in terms of delivery of that education. Perhaps I just want to pick on how do you, or maybe what are some of the ways and thought processes we should be thinking about when developing a new proposition, both from a content perspective as well as channel and format of delivery, maybe referring to the insurance world and how you guys do it.
Yeah, out and out customer obsession means that you are curious about what really motivates your customers, your potential customers. What are their unmet needs? We have, because we're regulated, we have to have quite a structured process, which is good. It's good. It's a good constraint, but it means that we have to do a lot of work to the discovery, cast the net wide, what might interest customers, and then go through sort of various scoring. But it's always the customer that decides. And so not personal subjectivity, but actually a data-driven exercise, but engaging customers directly. And we do a bit of co-creation, although it's difficult for us because often customers don't know what they don't know about insurance. So that's a bit harder. So we have to work a bit harder in that regard. But the simple answer, Richie, is, everyone will have their own process that's relevant to their context. But it really just starts with that customer obsession. And again, Amazon have that right up front, the mythical chair in the room that represents the customer. What would the customer say? Why would they care? All of that. So that is the biggest truism of marketing, will never go away. It's only relevant up to the point that it's relevant to your customers' unmet needs.
Great. And then I guess thinking about formats and ways in which people are engaging with insurance brands, but even reflecting on maybe some of your FMCG days and how that's evolving. Is there anything that we should be thinking about in terms of the way consumers now want to consume information, which may be relevant to the audience?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to have too much wisdom beyond the bleeding obvious, which is that people are much more attention deficit in terms of overload of information, much more digital. There's no doubt that the pandemic has accelerated digitization, but not just penetration, if you like, how many people are and how much time. That's the obvious bit. But I think also the nuance is doing more complicated things, medical stuff, prescriptions, diagnosis. People who perhaps previously had never even thought to do things online or digitally or through a mobile are now almost by being forced to, but are adopting new behaviours. So the world is much more digital, which raises the bar again on creativity and cut through, and also risk of frequency. So wasting money is much easier in a digital world when you don't really know what's landing. Bots, 1 pixel delivery, exposure adverts, waste, low attention span. So I mean, it's a bit of a tangential answer, but it just says, just assume that consumers don't really care what you're telling them about and don't have the time or attention for it, and are distracted by other things all at the same time. So in terms of getting your message across, you've just got to be really focused on what differentiates you, what it is you're saying, what message you want to land.
And on that point, talking about the obsession around digital at the moment, clearly given the macro environment, do you think we've swung too far in that pendulum in relation to digital advertising and digital communications being the answer to everything?
Well, yeah. So interestingly, TV is not dead. And again, Ritson will talk to this. I mean, at the moment, TV inflation is running at 145%.
No way.
Because lots of new brands, disruptive brands, and the big digital brands are all piling in. And it sort of goes back to the the old chestnut that 60% of your spend should be on building the brand in outer years, and 40% should be in harvesting demand in year one. Varies a little bit by sector. Peter and Les Bennett Peterfield have done lots of research on this, and it's still true that mass communication is the best way to land a big brand building message. And so you've seen Amazon and Apple and Google pile into mainstream advertising. Now, there is a nuance, which is that increasingly traditional channels are becoming digital channels. The ability to serve programmatic TV advertising is emerging. So the channels themselves are evolving. So there's a much more of a blurred line between digital and non-digital anyway. But mass reach has been undervalued. But I think it's returning, and that's nuts and bolts. That's reflected in current inflation in media.
So guys, some really important messages to pick up there. 60-40 is the classic ratio of where you're trying to allocate your brand spend. So as Mark said, 60% into brand building activities, 40% into sales activation or activities that actually try and deliver for the here and now in terms of revenue generation.
One build, Richie, which is how do you win that conversation inside an organization? That this brand stuff means anything at all. And I think this is the art and the science bit, where I think you need both a bit of science to prove the point, and it could be using case studies. It could be using your own data, but to find a way to demonstrate the multiplier effect in outer years, in terms of sales ROI. I think there's that science bit, but also increasingly I've heard people saying, that a slightly more assumptive argument, which is, look, if we don't do that, we won't have a business in 5 years. So being a bit more sort of cataclysmic, fatalistic. That in combination with data, I think makes for a very powerful argument. And honestly, I have to have that conversation still quite regularly, and when new people join, to keep winning the argument that brand building it's not just imaginary.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a constant debate, and there was a lovely case study that Les Bennett, who is the guru of marketing effectiveness, talks of, and he talks about the AA in the UK. I don't know if you've come across this one, Mark. But effectively, going after there's a two sides to the coin here, which talks about effectiveness versus efficiency, and efficiency is effectively trying to drive your ROI up for every advertising dollar you spend, trying to get the most maximum amount of buck back for your money. And he said that the AA was getting so down the efficiency route that it actually stopped all other advertising except for an email campaign that drove the highest levels of efficiency. And then lo and behold, they were sitting there going, that's delivering amazing ROI. And yet we won't have a business in 5 years' time if we keep going down this road. And so they actually had to reverse it. And then what then happened was they actually, lo and behold, commissioned Adam and Eve, BBD, to basically then revitalize their brand communications. And that led them back into being highly effective as a brand lever, which then actually drove their efficiency by a certain amount. But it's about not being as obsessed with that and actually getting the balance between effectiveness and efficiency, which really saved the day for them.
Yeah, so I think Cheryl Calverley was at the helm for that. It's an interesting one because digital gives the possibility to be more numerical, more quantitative, have more metrics. But I've liked Breaking Bad as a box set has long since gone, but I particularly liked it. And that obviously sort of brought methamphetamine into our lives, but there's a very addictive thing, not literally, just through the TV screen. But anyway, some of these digital KPIs are more addictive than methamphetamine because you do get sucked into that vortex and very hard to fight your way out. So there's a salutary lesson in be careful the metrics you choose to use to the senior leaders of the business and boards and so on.
I'll tell you, Mark, the other thing that people underestimate when it comes to brand, everyone gets really obsessed with brand building. Broad reach equals market share, getting more customers through more students in the context of this conversation. Actually, what people do forget typically is that you're able to charge more for the pleasure of doing so. And a classic analogy that I always kind of revert to is if you think about the role of what Harvard is currently doing, the ability to kind of have their short executive education courses and charge a significant amount for the pleasure of doing so, is all based on their brand equity that they built over a long period of time. Because quite honestly, the ability to get cutting edge information and insight and content through the door is actually becoming easier than ever before, right? So to be able to achieve a Harvard style education through a disruptive play and getting a lot more voices in the mix is becoming easier than it ever has done. And yet, Harvard still be able to charge double, triple, or quadruple the amount of other education institutions because of the equity of the brand that's then been built in. That pricing moment of discussion is something that's often led out, and that doesn't come through sales activation. That actually only comes through great brand building, the premiumization of the product and proposition.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Well worth considering, guys, particularly from an education point of view, about how that comes to and how that plays out. And it really is about strong brand building in that sense. Mark, I want to talk about service delivery. Now, clearly, as an insurer, you're dealing with an intangible product, quite like education in some respects. And actually, proof is in the pudding. Again, the service that you get from an education perspective is absolutely key to this. So what would you say are some of the ways you would go about defining your customer experience, and then making sure that you deliver to that service level that's been expected?
Yeah, it's a great point. We have 7,000 people on the phones 24/7, 365 days a year, helping customers. And I think this is very much about culture as much as anything. I saw Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever, talking in the early days of the pandemic, and he said, we think Unilever were quite well placed because long since we'd said that treating our people well is the first priority amongst our stakeholders, shareholders, ESG, people, customers, so on. It all starts with our people, and then they pay it forward onto our customers. So for us, measuring the hell out of customer experience is a thing, as in we measure every customer journey, the drop-off points, the customer journey analysis, how do we optimize, we set the targets, those targets link to everybody's bonus, including all board members, all the way through the organization. So there's that part. But I think what comes before that, or underpins that, is, again, that customer obsession. And investing in our people to enable them to be customer obsessed. One quite straightforward example, we did a program across all of those staff in terms of their profiles. You'll remember various profiles: red, blue, yellow, green. Red, action oriented; yellow, creative; green, people; blue, more sort of data and process. Flex styles. It's called, quite straightforward. But we trained our people to understand very quickly what type of flex style the customer was as they were coming through, and to have the techniques to adapt to that. So the red person wants to get to the chase. The yellow person might want to throw it around a bit. The green person, just wants to have a really good conversation, and the blue person wants to know the detail. And so you can say, well, that sounds a bit oversimplified, but the point is, it makes our people think about who it is on the other end of the phone. It's not just another phone call, it's an in towards that customer obsession. So I think it starts with people, but it underpins that is the way that you treat your people. And it's sort of so obvious to say, but the way you treat your people is the way that they will treat their staff. Don't expect people who maybe are not looking for a job for life, it's a transition thing, whatever, to bridge a gap between what a customer, what a company does to them or does for them versus what they will then do for customers. But don't underplay how scientific we are in the approach of measurement.
By the way, I think that's a super relevant point there, and from an education perspective, I think we often, and by all means, please put in the comments if you think different. We often leave it to the end of a term or semester to get any sort of feedback on how we're doing. And by that point, you're already too late in the process. The die has already been cast. And actually, in today's world, you have the ability to literally get instant feedback, which then gets fed right through to a central system where red flags can be made and developed. And it's not that difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Richie. And we do tend to use Net Promoter Score as the lightning rod for this. And a really interesting exercise we did was to plot NPS from 0 to 10 against retention. which for us is a really key lever in our business model, because generally insurers don't really make any money for a couple of years because of the discounting of the business. It's about to change with new regulation in the UK, but anyway. And what's interesting is that there was a 30-point improvement from a 0 to a 10 NPS. You might think, well, yeah, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? But we sweat over 0.5% of retention, such as is criticality. So here we had a data point which we could use internally and with our investors to say, here is the inherent value of customer orientation. Not we think, but we know and we can predict and score it. And therefore, customer equals commercial, not customer conflicts with commercial.
Mark, what an insight, honestly. And I think that it's something I'm kind of getting a bit more obsessed over these days. It's looking at the metrics that do genuinely matter. And we can get awfully caught up in a whole lot of bump that actually doesn't really make too much difference. And so, you know, what you talked about with NPS, guys, I would really urge everyone on listening in to think about whether you do implement NPS and actually how that then links back to your student outcomes of what you're trying to drive towards. I love that, and it's something that I'm going to look at as soon as we get off this call, quite frankly. The second thing that I'm starting to obsess over is share of search, because that is a very keen metric to determine the level of way people perceive you and have mental availability in the mind's eye. And what I mean by that is a very simple analogy that I tend to use, which is if you win in the customer's mind, you win on the ground. And so if you occupy, and visually, I always look at, okay, so you got your brain, and in your brain is you got a very small space for different types of brands. But let's just take the fact that your whole brain is filled with different brands. The ones that occupy more of your brain space are ones that are typically going to win more market share on the ground, as it were. So win in the mind, win on the ground. And share of search is just a fabulous way to really understand if you are winning in the mind, which then can both translate immediately, but also into the future, predict what competitors are likely to occupy more space on the ground. Is that something you guys measure?
Yeah, 100%. So for eons, you could plot a chart which had a 45-degree line, share of market, share of search, brands that overinvested share of voice well, you know, with good creative and all that, versus share of market are likely to grow market share. And that was typically done against sort of TV and mass media. Now increasingly exactly the same slide, chart with a 45-degree line, share of search, share of market. And you can see, you know, we can see in our sector on a weekly basis, monthly basis, annual basis, who's investing for growth, to grow their footprint, to grow their awareness, to grow their brand, and so on. Share of search has another nuance, though, in that it is a directly competitive gig. Share of voice in a TV space, your bids don't increase the price that others pay because there's basically market rates, pre-negotiated rates, or whatever. Of course, in share of search, in the Google algorithm, you're competing directly and you bid each other up. So I just think there's even extra spice, but the principle is exactly the same. If you're not seen and not heard, you will not be building the memory structures. Just on that, we're sponsors of Ehrenberg Bass, the Byron Sharp, the academic institution coming out of Melbourne in Australia, very empirically driven, and they talk a lot about simply the mental and physical availability, being present in people's minds when they create an association or what's called category entry points, and knowing what your category entry points are and being mentally and physically available when people go into those category entry points. It sounds so obvious, but it's still not that widespread as a notion. So maybe there's a bit of a sort of an advantage to be had there if you study the work of Byron Sharp.
Oh, I absolutely love the work of Byron Sharp. Getting quite obsessed with it, to be honest. But it's just the empiricalness. And by the way, anyone who's really obsessing about marketing, honestly, leaning on the data effectiveness gurus, Les Binet, Peter Field, Grace Kite, Tom Roach, Byron Sharp, just to name a few, are guys that you really should, guys and gals who you really should be, following as such. Mark, I want to just come to, you're one of the leading employers in the UK, and you've certainly had global experience around the world of different employers. In the marketing function specifically, what type of skills are you looking for when it comes to entry level employees, and what would you hold them in good stead in order to, to be honing in as educators in this current day?
Yeah, I think the cliche is that everyone needs to be digitally oriented, have digital skills. So I'm going to say that's a given. What I've always looked to recruit personally, and whatever level of seniority, is actually based on three key things, and it's the crux of our graduate talent pipeline process. My sporting metaphor here is you want people who can see the gap, see the opportunity, have the IQ, not as in pure IQ, but have the curiosity and the brain power to see an opportunity. Then they need to also have the EQ to relate to people, to create momentum, to create following, to take people with them through that gap. But you also need people with drive, who will make it happen. And it kind of runs like this. That person that has high IQ and high EQ will have great ideas and great followership, but actually won't really push it through. That person that has great IQ and great drive, but doesn't have EQ, will just annoy the hell out of everybody. And that person who has great EQ and great drive will drive people over the cliff towards rubbish ideas. So EQ, IQ, drive, in a sports metaphor, spotting the gap, going for it, taking people with you through that gap. Either way you look at it, sports metaphor or EQ, IQ, drive, it's that roundedness that I'm looking for, because it's actually dangerous if people aren't reasonably competent on all three of them.
Wow.
Now, of course, it's great as a development framework as well, because you're never perfect on any of them. But where are the things that you can major on? So do you need to evoke more curiosity and knowledge development, IQ? Do you need to figure out how do you create more momentum, following, inspiration, leadership in the EQ space? Or do you need to find out, get that resolve, that determination, that energy, that drive? It's quite an actionable but very simple framework on how you create impact.
I tell you what, that's super insightful, and something that is fairly tangible that we can take away as educators to work through as to how we're delivering across that spectrum. What are you seeing coming through though, in the context of young talent? Are you seeing that combination coming through, or do you think we have to work harder from this perspective?
Well, what I'm seeing is more and more curiosity. I mean, I think the world has shrunk. If I just take my kids, the first I knew that there was a world out there was Band Aid in 1980, whatever it was. And it wasn't a good message, because, this is the first notion that there's underprivilege and inequality. But the world has shrunk. And so I just think that makes Gen Z and younger folk more curious, but with a watch out of being a bit more whimsical and not recognizing that good things take time to nurture. Longevity can be good, tenure can be good, and so I think it's that juggle. But I see great, and partly this is me saying I'm a bit old now, but I see great energy and passion and enthusiasm, digital orientation, experimentation, open-mindedness to change. But also, if you're trying to create an enduring brand, you've got to register that some things just take time to cultivate.
Yeah. Mark, I mean, that's what fabulous insights, both from being able to being able to look at how to build a brand in the first instance, all the way through to discussions around the product and becoming truly customer centric in what we're trying to achieve. And then being really obsessive over that customer experience and perhaps the delivery, which is the ultimate kind of link point between the brand promise and actually then going out and being able to do exactly what you say. So it's been some really great insights there, Mark, and particularly when your final model about that skill set that's required, the concentric circles playing out and making it really tangible. And actually, even being a bit of a benchmark for educators today to be able to recognize where they may be falling short from their educational sort of ways and techniques and tools. So do you, any parting wisdom that you may share for anyone who is currently looking at their marketing from, whether they be at a college or a university, or looking after a group of students, is there anything that you think, piece of advice that you may give from your world that could translate into theirs that could be useful to share before we depart?
I'm going to re-emphasize the funnel. So to share something which is embryonic in our organization, we've thought a lot about what's the capabilities that we're going to need to succeed, marketing capabilities that we're going to need to succeed in the next 5 years. And we've had these capability programs for forever. But the framework for that capability program has kind of been plucked from the sky. Oh, we need commerciality, or we need digital skills, or it's like, yeah, obviously. But we're going to do a complete flip on that now, and we're going to use the marketing funnel to define the capabilities that we need in our context for our funnel. And I just think, gosh, I've brand learning, e-consultancy, all of these educators in the digital marketing and marketing space. I've never seen it. I've always just seen frameworks that are plucked from the sky, as opposed to how do consumers actually move through to buy something. And in a way, it's the same stuff. It's, awareness to drive people to the top of the funnel, great, media skills to do that efficiently and effectively. It is customer journeys as people move through. It is, the ease to purchase. It is, quote follow-up, and all sorts of sort of nuts and bolts stuff. But to frame it in the context of the funnel, I think is sort of a bit of a eureka. Maybe I'm giving away a bit of IP there. I don't know. But the point is, why is it that the funnel is just not all pervasive? Again, Mark Ritson would tout the funnel, but he doesn't build his MBA around it.
Mark, I think it's a lovely point, and I think there's been a little bit of controversy around sort of funnel-based concept, but the way you describe it, actually just becoming a helpful framework to think about marketing capability, and how you therefore sort of plan for the future, is super relevant. And so a bit of a last piece of nugget to take away. So look, on that note, Mark, absolute pleasure to have had you here this morning. I hope everyone listening in, both live and playback, enjoyed the session. Do give us any feedback you may have, talking about customer obsession. Love to hear anything that you may have that we could adapt and change the series to. So on that note, Mark, thanks once again. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch up with you all soon.
Pleasure, Richie. Thank you.
Take care.